the ancient Israelites forged the very fabric of Western civilization. Their epic story of exile, conquest, and spiritual quest shaped the course of human history. Let us embark on a journey through the desert sands of time and uncover the timeless secrets of a people who changed the world forever. The region of Canaan, with its rolling hills, verdant valleys, and snow-capped mountains, was a land of breathtaking beauty, where the rhythms of nature were deeply intertwined with the lives of its inhabitants. The earliest roots of the Israelite people are shrouded in mystery, but historians and archaeologists have pieced together a narrative that takes us back to the 2nd millennium BCE. During this period, the region of Canaan was inhabited by a diverse array of cultures, including the Canaanites, Philistines, and other neighboring tribes. The city-states of Canaan, with their impressive fortifications, temples, and palaces, were centers of commerce, politics, and culture, where merchants, diplomats, and travelers from all over the ancient world converged. It was against this backdrop that the Israelites first appeared on the scene, their arrival marked by a series of migrations and conquests that would ultimately shape the course of their history. The biblical account of the Israelites' origins, as recorded in the book of Genesis, tells us that they were descended from Abraham, a patriarch who lived in the city of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia. According to this narrative, Abraham was called by God to leave his homeland and journey to Canaan, where he would become the father of a great nation. While the historicity of the biblical account is subject to ongoing debate among scholars, archaeological evidence suggests that there were indeed migrations of Semitic peoples from Mesopotamia to Canaan during the 2nd millennium BCE. These migrants brought with them their own distinct culture, language, and traditions, which would eventually coalesce into a unique Israelite identity. One of the most significant events in the early history of the Israelites was their sojourn in Egypt, where they lived as slaves for centuries before being liberated by the great leader Moses. The biblical account of the Israelites' time in Egypt is well known, with its stories of plagues, miracles, and divine intervention. The Israelites' experience in Egypt had a profound impact on their development as a people, shaping their sense of identity, their religious practices, and their understanding of themselves as a chosen nation. It was during this period that the Israelites developed their unique system of laws, rituals, and sacrifices, which would become the foundation of their spiritual life. As the Israelites emerged from their Egyptian sojourn, they found themselves at the threshold of a new era, one that would be marked by conquest, settlement, and the gradual formation of a distinct national identity. The leader who would guide them through this pivotal period was Joshua, a skilled military strategist and devoted follower of Moses, who had been chosen to succeed him as the leader of the Israelites. According to the biblical account, Joshua's first major challenge was the conquest of Jericho, a heavily fortified city located in the eastern part of Canaan, which controlled access to the Jordan Valley and the surrounding regions. The siege of Jericho, as described in the book of Joshua, was a remarkable event that showcased the Israelites' military prowess and their faith in the divine. The city's imposing walls, which had withstood countless attacks by previous invaders, were breached after a 7-day siege, during which the Israelites marched around the city, accompanied by the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant. While the historicity of this event is subject to ongoing debate among scholars, archaeological excavations at Jericho have revealed a complex and intriguing picture, with evidence of a massive stone wall that collapsed around 1400 BCE, roughly coinciding with the time period described in the biblical account. The conquest of Jericho marked the beginning of a long and bloody campaign as the Israelites sought to subdue the various city-states and kingdoms of Canaan. The biblical narrative describes a series of military victories, including the defeat of the Amorite king Og, who ruled over a vast territory stretching from the Jordan River to the Lebanon mountains. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is the complex web of alliances and rivalries that emerged between the Israelites and the various other groups inhabiting Canaan. The biblical account describes a series of treaties and covenants, including the famous alliance between the Israelites and the Gibeonites, a group of Hivites who lived in the region of Benjamin. This alliance, which was sealed through a clever ruse, allowed the Gibeonites to avoid destruction at the hands of the Israelites, while also providing them with a degree of protection against their common enemies. As the Israelites continued their conquest of Canaan, they began to establish a network of settlements and cities, which would eventually coalesce into a loose confederation of tribes. The biblical narrative describes a system of governance in which each tribe was responsible for its own internal affairs, while also contributing to the overall defense and well-being of the Israelite community. This system, which was based on a combination of kinship ties, geographic proximity, and shared religious practices, would ultimately provide the foundation for the development of a distinct Israelite identity. The process of settlement and consolidation was not without its challenges, however. As the Israelites faced opposition from various groups, including the Philistines, who inhabited the coastal regions of Canaan. The biblical account describes a series of skirmishes and battles between the Israelites and the Philistines, including the famous duel between the Israelite champion David and the Philistine giant Goliath. As the Israelites continued to settle and consolidate their hold on Canaan, they began to develop a more complex system of governance, one that would eventually give rise to the monarchy. The biblical narrative describes a period of transition in which the Israelites were ruled by a series of judges who were chosen for their wisdom, military prowess, and devotion to the divine. One of the most fascinating figures from this period is the judge Deborah, a prophetic leader who rallied the Israelites against the Canaanite general Sisera and his army. The biblical account describes a decisive victory in which the Israelites defeated the Canaanites through a combination of military force and divine intervention. As the Israelites continued to develop their system of governance under the judges, they faced numerous challenges from both within and outside their community. One of the most significant threats came from the Moabite king Eglon, who formed an alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites to attack the Israelites. The biblical narrative describes how Eglon's forces captured the city of Jericho and oppressed the Israelites for 18 years, until they were finally delivered by the judge Ehud, a left-handed Benjamite who assassinated Eglon in his palace. This daring act of bravery not only freed the Israelites from Moabite rule, but also sparked a period of relative peace and prosperity under the leadership of Ehud's successor, Shamgar. Shamgar's tenure as judge is notable for its brevity, with a biblical account suggesting that he ruled for only a short time before being succeeded by Deborah's fellow judge, Barak. However, it was during this period that the Israelites began to consolidate their hold on the region of Galilee, where they established a series of settlements and cities. The most notable of these was the city of Hazor, which would eventually become a major center of Israelite power and culture. Archaeological excavations at Hazor have revealed a complex and sophisticated urban center with evidence of extensive trade networks and cultural exchange with neighboring regions. As the Israelites continued to expand their territories, they faced increasing pressure from the Philistines, who had established themselves as a major power in the region. The biblical narrative describes a series of skirmishes and battles between the Israelites and the Philistines, including the famous Battle of Aphek, where the Israelites were defeated and the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. This disastrous defeat marked a significant turning point in the history of the Israelites, as they began to realize that their system of governance under the judges was no longer effective in protecting them from external threats. In response to this crisis, the Israelites turned to a new form of leadership, with the emergence of the prophet Samuel as a dominant figure in their national life. Samuel, who is described in the biblical account as a wise and charismatic leader, played a key role in shaping the course of Israelite history, from his early days as a priest and judge to his later years as a prophet and kingmaker. It was during this period that the Israelites began to demand a monarch, like other nations, to rule over them and protect them from their enemies. This demand would eventually lead to the establishment of the Israelite monarchy, with Samuel playing a crucial role in anointing the first king, Saul, who would go on to shape the course of Israelite history in profound ways. The transition to monarchical rule was not without its challenges, however, as the Israelites struggled to reconcile their traditional system of governance under the judges with the new demands of kingship. The biblical narrative describes a period of tension and conflict between Samuel and Saul as the prophets sought to ensure that the new monarch would remain faithful to the traditions and values of the Israelites. Meanwhile, the Philistines continued to pose a significant threat to Israelite security, with their powerful army and sophisticated military tactics presenting a major challenge to the newly established monarchy. As the Israelites navigated this complex web of internal politics and external threats, they also began to develop a more sophisticated system of worship and ritual practice. The biblical account describes the establishment of a number of important cultic sites, including the altar at Mizpah and the temple at Shiloh, which would play a central role in Israelite religious life for generations to come. These developments were closely tied to the emergence of the monarchy, as the Israelites sought to create a more centralized and unified system of worship that would reflect their new status as a nation-state. As the Israelites continued to develop their system of worship and ritual practice, they also began to solidify their monarchical institutions under King Saul. The biblical account describes how Saul, who had been anointed by Samuel as the first king of Israel, established his capital at Gibeah, a city in the tribe of Benjamin. From this power base, Saul set about consolidating his authority and expanding Israelite territories through a series of military campaigns against neighboring nations. One of the most significant challenges faced by Saul was the ongoing threat posed by the Philistines, who had been a thorn in the side of the Israelites for generations. The Philistines were a powerful and sophisticated people, with a strong military tradition and a network of fortified cities along the coastal plain of Canaan. In response to this threat, Saul launched a series of attacks against Philistine strongholds, including the city of Jabesh-Gilead, which had been besieged by the Philistines for some time. The siege of Jabesh-Gilead was eventually lifted by Saul, who led a daring rescue mission to save the city from Philistine control. This victory helped to establish Saul's reputation as a military leader and cemented his position as king of Israel. However, it also created tension between Saul and the Philistines, who vowed to take revenge against the Israelites for their defeat. As tensions between Israel and Philistia continued to escalate, Saul found himself facing increasing pressure from his own people to deliver a decisive victory against the Philistines. The biblical account describes how Saul became increasingly isolated and paranoid, surrounding himself with a loyal inner circle of advisors and relying on divination and sacrifice to guide his decision-making. Despite these challenges, Saul remained a formidable military leader, and his campaigns against the Philistines continued to yield significant victories. One of the most notable of these was the Battle of Michmash, where Saul led a daring raid against a Philistine garrison and succeeded in capturing a large quantity of enemy equipment and supplies. The victory at Michmash helped to boost Saul's popularity among the Israelites, who saw him as a strong and effective leader. However, it also created new challenges for the king, as he struggled to maintain control over his own people and navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the ancient Near East. As the years passed, Saul's relationships with other nations in the region became increasingly complicated. The biblical account describes how he formed an alliance with the Moabites, who were traditional enemies of the Israelites, and launched a series of attacks against the Ammonites, who had long been a thorn in the side of the Israelites. Despite these military successes, Saul's reign was ultimately marked by tragedy and controversy. The biblical account describes how he became increasingly obsessed with the young warrior David, who had risen to prominence as a member of Saul's court and had become a favorite of the people. Saul's jealousy of David eventually boiled over into violence, and he launched a series of attempts on the younger man's life. Saul's attempts on David's life ultimately proved unsuccessful, as the young warrior was able to evade the king's agents and find refuge with Samuel, the prophet who had anointed Saul as king. Meanwhile, David's popularity continued to grow, and he became a leader among the people, earning their respect and admiration for his bravery and military prowess. As tensions between Saul and David escalated, the Philistines saw an opportunity to exploit the divisions within Israel and launched a series of attacks against the kingdom. In response, Saul mobilized his army and prepared to face the Philistines in battle. However, he became increasingly isolated and withdrawn, relying on divination and sacrifice to guide his decision-making. The biblical account describes how Saul consulted with the medium of Endor, seeking guidance from the spirit of Samuel, who had died earlier. The medium, however, was reluctant to conjure up the spirit of the deceased prophet, fearing the wrath of Saul. Nevertheless, she eventually relented and summoned the spirit of Samuel, who delivered a stern message to Saul, predicting his downfall and the defeat of Israel at the hands of the Philistines. Undeterred by this ominous prophecy, Saul pressed on with his plans to engage the Philistines in battle. The two armies clashed on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, where the Israelites were decisively defeated. The Philistines, led by their champion, Goliath's relatives, inflicted heavy casualties on the Israelite army, and Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, were all killed in the battle. As the Israelite army fled in disarray, Saul was wounded by the Philistines, and, fearing that he would be captured and humiliated, asked his armor-bearer to kill him. When the armor-bearer refused, Saul took his own life, falling on his sword rather than risk being taken prisoner. The news of Saul's death sent shockwaves throughout Israel, and the kingdom was plunged into a period of mourning and uncertainty. In the aftermath of Saul's death, David, who had been living in exile among the Philistines, was finally able to return to Israel and claim the throne that had been promised to him by God. The biblical account describes how David was anointed king over the tribe of Judah, while the rest of Israel remained loyal to Saul's son Ishbosheth, who had been proclaimed king by Abner, Saul's former commander. The division between Judah and the rest of Israel created a power vacuum that would take years to resolve. David, however, was determined to unite the kingdom under his rule, and set about consolidating his power base in Hebron, the capital of Judah. He established a strong and efficient administration, appointing able leaders to govern the various regions of the kingdom, and promoting trade and commerce throughout the land. As David's power grew, so did his reputation as a wise and just ruler. The biblical account describes how he was able to bring peace and prosperity to Israel, expanding the kingdom's borders through a series of military campaigns against neighboring nations. One of his earliest victories was against the Jebusites, who had long occupied the city of Jerusalem, which David would eventually capture and make his capital. The capture of Jerusalem marked a significant turning point in David's reign, as it provided him with a strategic location from which to govern the kingdom and consolidate his power. The city, which had been inhabited by the Jebusites for centuries, was transformed into a thriving metropolis with a strong and efficient administration, a vibrant economy, and a rich cultural life. David's successes, however, were not limited to the military sphere. He was also a talented musician and poet, and his compositions, including the Psalms, would become an integral part of Israelite worship and liturgy. The biblical account describes how David established a system of worship in Jerusalem, appointing Levites to serve as priests and musicians, and creating a rich and vibrant ritual life that would be observed by generations of Israelites to come. As David's reign continued, he faced numerous challenges, including the threat posed by the Philistines, who remained a powerful and hostile force on Israel's borders. He also had to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the ancient Near East, forming treaties with neighboring nations and engaging in diplomatic efforts to secure Israel's position in the region. Despite these challenges, David remained committed to his vision of a unified and prosperous Israel, and he worked tirelessly to promote the welfare of his people. The biblical account describes how he established a system of justice, appointing wise and fair judges to govern the various regions of the kingdom, and promoting social justice and equality throughout the land. One notable example of David's diplomatic efforts was his alliance with King Toi of Hamath, who sent his son Joram to congratulate David on his victory over Hadadezer, king of Zobah. The biblical account describes how David also took steps to strengthen the economy, encouraging trade and commerce, and establishing a strong and efficient administrative system. As David grew older, he began to make preparations for the succession of his son Solomon, who would eventually inherit the throne. According to the biblical account, David instructed Solomon to obey God's laws and to build a temple in Jerusalem, which would serve as the central place of worship for the Israelites. David also provided Solomon with detailed plans and materials for the construction of the temple, including large quantities of gold, silver, and bronze. After a reign of 40 years, David died at the age of 70, and Solomon succeeded him as king of Israel. Solomon's reign marked a new era of peace and prosperity for Israel, during which he established trade relationships with neighboring nations, including Egypt and Tyre. He also oversaw the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was completed in approximately 7 years. The temple, also known as the First Temple, was a magnificent structure that served as the central place of worship for the Israelites. It was built on Mount Moriah, where Abraham had earlier been instructed to sacrifice his son Isaac, and it housed the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the 10 Commandments. The temple complex included a large courtyard, an altar, and a series of chambers and rooms, including the Holy of Holies, where the high priest would enter once a year on the Day of Atonement. Solomon's reign was marked by wisdom and justice, and he became known for his fairness and compassion. He established a strong and efficient administrative system, dividing the kingdom into 12 districts, each governed by an appointed official. He also promoted the arts and culture, encouraging music, poetry, and other forms of creative expression. However, towards the end of Solomon's reign, the kingdom began to face internal divisions and external threats. The biblical account describes how Solomon's many foreign wives led him astray, and he began to worship idols and engage in pagan practices. This led to a decline in his relationship with God, and the kingdom began to suffer as a result. As Solomon grew older, the kingdom was plagued by rebellions and uprisings, including a major revolt led by Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials. According to the biblical account, Jeroboam had been appointed by Solomon to oversee the labor force in Jerusalem, but he became disillusioned with Solomon's leadership and began to secretly gather support among the northern tribes. After Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided into 2 parts: the kingdom of Judah, which consisted of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and the kingdom of Israel, which consisted of the remaining 10 tribes. Jeroboam became the first king of the kingdom of Israel, while Rehoboam, Solomon's son, became the first king of the kingdom of Judah. The division of the kingdom marked a significant turning point in the history of the ancient Israelites, and it would have far-reaching consequences for generations to come. The 2 kingdoms would engage in a series of conflicts and power struggles, with each side seeking to assert its dominance over the other. The biblical account describes how the kingdom of Israel would eventually be conquered by the Assyrians, while the kingdom of Judah would continue to exist until it was conquered by the Babylonians. The Babylonian conquest of Judah marked the end of the monarchic period in ancient Israelite history, and it would lead to a significant shift in the cultural, social, and religious practices of the Israelites. The biblical account describes how many Israelites were taken into exile in Babylon, where they would be forced to adapt to a new culture and way of life. However, despite these challenges, the Israelites would continue to maintain their identity and faith, and they would eventually return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and restore their nation. The post-exilic period marked a new era of Jewish history, during which the Israelites would seek to rebuild and restore their nation. The biblical account describes how the Israelites would return to Jerusalem under the leadership of figures such as Ezra and Nehemiah, who would oversee the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of the city walls. The post-exilic period was marked by a renewed emphasis on Torah study and observance, as well as a greater focus on individual piety and devotion. The Israelites would also begin to develop new forms of worship and community, including the synagogue, which would become a central institution in Jewish life. As the centuries passed, the Israelites would continue to face challenges and threats, including the rise of Hellenism and the Roman Empire. However, despite these challenges, they would maintain their identity and faith, and they would continue to thrive as a distinct cultural and religious community. The biblical account describes how the Israelites would eventually be dispersed throughout the ancient world, where they would establish vibrant communities in cities such as Alexandria and Babylon. The dispersion of the Israelites marked the end of the biblical period in Jewish history, and it would lead to a new era of Jewish life and culture. The Israelites would continue to maintain their faith and traditions, even as they adapted to new cultures and ways of life. They would also begin to develop new forms of literature and art, including the Talmud and other rabbinic writings. The legacy of the ancient Israelites continues to be felt today, with their history, culture, and faith remaining an integral part of Western civilization. The biblical account remains a central text in Jewish and Christian traditions, and its stories, teachings, and values continue to inspire and guide people around the world. Despite the many challenges and changes that the Israelites faced over the centuries, Their faith and identity have endured, and they remain a vibrant and thriving community to this day. Their story, marked by triumph and tragedy, faith and perseverance, has indelibly shaped the course of human history, influencing cultures, religions, and civilizations to this day. The resilience of their spirit, the richness of their culture, and the profundity of their faith have left an enduring imprint on our collective heritage. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.